Okay, so I'm going to compare the difference between wet on wet with ink and wet on dry, so you can see the different effects that you can get with those two techniques. I've got some Indian ink here, which is a very black kind of ink which can be diluted and which dries waterproof. You can use this technique really with any coloured ink which is dilutable, or with watercolour paint as well. It would also work with acrylic paint if you dilute it down enough. So I have 2 pots of water. One is my dirty pot, so that's what I use to clean off my brush, and this one's to get my fresh clean water from. And then I have a palette here for diluting my ink on, so I can see different greys. Some tissue and my paper. Now the paper is fairly thick. This is a type of watercolour paper. The reason for using this is if I use printer paper or cartridge paper, so normal sketchbook paper, I will find that the paper will wrinkle up a lot and will potentially get holes in from the water. So thicker paper is best for this technique, but if you're just practicing and you want to try it out, you can do it in a sketchbook. That is totally fine. So first off, for the wet on wet, I'm going to take some fresh water, and on this side of my paper I'm just going to cover an area of the paper with clean fresh water. So I'm not too worried about what shape I'm making or anything. Just want to make sure I've got decent coverage, so if I kind of tip it in the light I can see it's shiny where the water is. Now, just to see what happens when you put your wet ink on the wet paper, I have some Indian ink here which I've diluted down a little bit because it is very thick. You can see how thick and black it is. If I add some of this now to the wet area of my paper, you can see how much it bleeds across the paper. So you have the darker bit where I've put the ink on, but then there's a large area of bleed, and you see where it's really wet, it's kind of almost dribbling across the paper. It should stay within that wet area that I've created though. If I was to use some of the thick ink just on the edge of this wet area here at the bottom, if I go along the bottom, you can see how I get a very sharp line where the paper is quite dry, but as soon as it hits that water it really flows up. So you can get a lot of beautiful techniques with this, sort of rough surface effects, and a really nice patterner can be created using that. So now to show you wet on dry. So this side of my paper is still dry as it was before. I'm going to dilute my ink down a little more now, so I get a very varying shade of grey. So if I just apply my ink, you can see it dries off because the paper is quite thick. It's really sucking the moisture out of that. See, it dries off as I do my brush strokes, and it's not spreading at all, it's just staying where I've put it. And then I can add more using different darknesses of ink. Now if I was to go over the top of those, they're still slightly damp and I would get the wet on wet effect. So you see there's a bit of bleeding within that. So the nice thing about doing this is you can leave it to dry and then add dry on top, so you won't get any spread. So if I was to leave this to dry now, in say half an hour, I could add some strokes like this on top and they wouldn't bleed because the paper would be completely dry. So with something like Indian ink, because it dries waterproof, you can layer it up. If I was using watercolour paint, it's a different story because watercolour paint will reanimate when I add wet on top of it. So if I had, say, pink stripes here and then I added yellow on top, they would combine to give me orange.